prohibit the attorneys from making certain types of arguments in an effort to persuade you to reach a certain result or to favor or discredit either party. For example, the attorneys are not permitted to refer to facts that are not in evidence in this case. They are not permitted to suggest that you should draw inferences that are not fairly based on the evidence. If based upon your memory and understanding of the evidence a lawyer does this, you should and must disregard that comment. The attorneys are not permitted to express their personal belief in the credibility or lack of credibility of any witness who testified in this case. That determination is entirely for you, the jury, to make. If a lawyer makes such a comment, you should disregard that comment. This case must be decided solely on the basis of admissible evidence and the law that I give to you. Attorneys are not permitted to persuade you for or against either party by appealing to human passions or prejudices. If you become conscious of any passion or prejudice as you consider the evidence or engage in your deliberations, you must put these feelings aside and not permit them to influence your thinking. If a lawyer makes such a comment, you should disregard that comment. We are now prepared and ready for the closing arguments. I'll invite Attorney Elkins to do so.
Good morning. In a few minutes after I speak and after ADA Green speaks, the judge is going to be explaining to you that in charging Blake Scanlon with first-degree murder, that the Commonwealth has taken upon itself to prove every element of murder beyond a reasonable doubt. And of course, that's their burden. But the judge is also going to be explaining to you that in charging Mr. Scanlon that way, they have also taken upon themselves the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that there was no mitigation. And the judge is going to explain to you what that means. And in this case, specifically what it means is that the judge is going to talk to you about how that there are some things that are so, in the experience of human experience, that reasonable people can experience overwhelm, anger, emotion, such that they can't control themselves. And that is something that you can consider. And what this means when you begin your deliberation, you must, for a moment, at least in your discussions, put aside the outcome, the very horrible, terrible outcome, and spend some time wrestling with what led up to this tragedy. Now, one thing is clear. Miss Avery, Mr. Scanlon, at the time of this incident, were still in a relationship. That doesn't mean that a split wasn't coming. It doesn't mean that that hadn't been communicated to Mr. Scanlon, to Blake. Were they splitting up? Yes, they were. But on this night, they had, at that point, been on again and off again since at least 2016. They had committed in June of 2018 to living together because a baby was on the way. They committed to living together, to making a family together, and making a home together. And Mr. Scanlon, Blake was there in August when Darla was born. He was there at Christmas, celebrating that first Christmas together. They were there. They were a family. They were a home. And he was working during that time. You'll see in some of the text messages that are before you that he was working to provide for his family, for their home. And this is where I'm asking you all to look at this circumstance, which is undoubtedly inconceivable to every one of us in here. But to say to yourself, and step back from that outcome, that inconceivable, horrible outcome, and think about the fact that when you have a child and when you have a home together, even if things are coming to an end, it's not just as simple as saying out loud, I want this to be over, and that everything in your entire life changes immediately. The love and care and concern that you each have for each other doesn't just turn off like a light switch. And in that moment, on January 11th, 2019, yes, the relationship was ending. The logistics of who was moving and where they were going and when that was happening was certainly in the air. But Blake, at that moment, had every reason to hope, and I think every one of us would hope in that situation, the splitting up of a family, the breaking up of a home, that as you're charting a course for what life looks like after that split, as you're each finding what family and home looks like after you part, that you'll consider each other. And certainly the time was coming when they would need to expect to be out in the world and see each other with other people, and to even know that they were intimate with other people. Certainly that time was coming. But on that night, they were still sleeping under the same roof, in the same home. They were raising their child. They were in an adult relationship with adult considerations that don't just turn off as if you're breaking up overnight. By all appearances, the evidence in every way suggests they were both coming home to 92 White Street that night, whatever their separate plans were. And so, of course, when Blake Scanlon opened the door to that truck, he was devastated. He was distraught. Anybody would be. This is the part where you have to put aside the outcome for a moment and consider in that moment, would reasonable people be upset and overwhelmed in that moment? And I suggest to you, beyond reasonable doubt, they would be. And listen, fault Blake if you must. In fact, I'm asking you, I'm saying you should fault Blake for not turning away when he saw them in the bar and saw what he saw in the bar. And fault him if you must for going to the whip. Absolutely. He should have removed himself from the situation. I can't disagree with that. But Alexis knew he was there too. Alexis knew she was going home that night with him. And when he opened that door to the truck, it was because of what he had seen. And of course, he saw what he saw. And so you have to ask yourself for just a minute, what can you know about how Blake felt in that moment when he opened that door? Well, first of all, what can you tell about that moment from Scott Burns' testimony? Well, it was the briefest of glimpses. It was a moment that for Mr. Burns was startling too, embarrassing, perhaps. And I'd suggest it was probably confusing, given what he thought he understood about the person he was with. But what it says about how Blake felt in that moment is very little. Because it was a brief glimpse. It was just a moment. And Scott was having to pull himself together as well. And how confusing is this moment for Scott, and how brief is that moment? He forgets all about who he came with, his friend in the bar, who he's supposed to give a ride home, and he immediately calls for an Uber. And we know what time that happened. It was at 1:19 a.m. You'll see that Uber receipt. But part of what you have to decide is, was Blake Scanlon in fact overwhelmed and distraught? And I would suggest to you that brief moment from Scott Burns doesn't tell us very much about that. But he did hear them arguing. He did hear that it was immediately, we need to go home. And he couldn't see them or where they went, but he heard them arguing, and then they were gone. And so if, like when you put a pot on the stove and you turn on the range, if that's the moment of provocation, if that is the moment when somebody is experiencing something that they would have overwhelm and distraught and, yes, anger and emotion about, the judge is also going to explain to you that the law says that you have to think about time to cool down. What can we expect in terms of, and what does the law require in terms of cooling down before you think about whether or not this mitigates? And I am going to suggest to you, and I say to you, that before you can answer the question of did he cool down, was there time for him to cool down, I ask you to think about whether or not the heat had even been turned off at that point in time. By far, the best thing for these two people to have done after that emotional, difficult moment would have been to not go home together, 100%. But I ask you to think about what Scott Burns said he heard Alexis say in that moment, because it tells you a lot about what came in the minutes afterwards. I don't want to be with you, Blake. I want to be with him. And that's not about whether or not she was wrong or terrible, and certainly it's not the case that anything about that situation justified how it ended up. But you're asked to think about the effect that that had on Blake. And you're also, I would suggest to you, tells you a lot about what happened in the minutes that followed. And here's what I mean about that. It took them just minutes to get home. You know that Scott Burns barely got himself together. He doesn't even remember getting out of the car. He immediately orders an Uber at 1:19 a.m. You'll look at those videos that we looked at yesterday, and you'll see that by 1:20 or 1:21, they're turning the corner onto their street. They're literally seconds away. It is just mere minutes from that moment of discovery until they're back to their home. And even as she's getting out of Scott's truck, this is what she's saying. And so there's every reason to infer, every reason, that that was just the first thing she said to him in an argument about what Blake had just seen. A thing that anyone in that situation would have been overwhelmed by. And you can be sure that that discussion continued on that very short car ride home. And when they get to the apartment, the heat stayed on. It's still at a boil. There's not a cooling off period in that scenario. We know that things happened very quickly after they got home, and here's how you can know that. She's still in the same top that she went out in. Nobody got into their pajamas. Nobody turned on the TV. There's no evidence of that. In the kitchen in their small apartment, steps from the door they came in on. They're in the kitchen. There's no place to sit. They're standing. The discussion is continuing. And based on what you heard about what she said when he first discovered it, you can be sure, I suggest to you, you can be sure it is a very fair inference that the nature of that conversation and what she was saying and how things were going, that was not a discussion that was turning the heat down in any way. And so they're in the kitchen. The knife is an impulse away. And I'm sure A.A. Green is going to spend a lot of time talking about the injuries and about the terrible outcome here. And of course, he should. That's his job. But I would ask you to consider one thing about the circumstances of the outcome. What is that kind of outburst, but a loss of control? What is that? But irrationality, impulse, and loss of control. All of that occurred within, by any fair estimation of this evidence, within minutes of Blake opening that truck door and seeing what he saw. Now, you're going to see, you know they were home within minutes. And you're going to see that there were text messages between Alexis's phone and Caitlin's phone, back and forth. And I'm going to suggest you make of those what you will, about who sent them, about what had gone on in the apartment, in the home before then. But know this, no matter what you think about who sent them and what had happened at that point, it was not even an hour since Blake saw what he saw. Less than an hour of uninterrupted overwhelm in the aftermath of an experience that anybody would find difficult and overwhelming, in the middle of an experience which anybody might react in ways that they just don't understand or know of themselves. The judge is also going to tell you about something called consciousness of guilt. There is a lot. This was a very short trial for a murder trial, and a lot of what we talked about was about what happened after we know Miss Avery died. These texts back and forth, Blake answering on her phone as if he is her, and the searches. And the judge is going to tell you that you can consider all of those things for consciousness of guilt. And this is what I say to you. Absolutely. Absolutely. In every way, everything about how Blake responded in that distraught and terrible aftermath showed that he was very conscious that he had done a very terrible thing. But that doesn't answer the question of what led into it when it happened. I'd also suggest that those acts, when you consider them, the first thing he does is he tries to kill himself. He tampers with the stove. He texts back in this way. Those are not the actions of someone who had any sort of plan, not even for a minute. Not for what happened, and certainly not for what would happen after he had done the terrible thing. But a point does come when he sobers up, when he awakens to know that he has not done what he set out to do when he tried to kill himself. And he finally just says it. He says he did this terrible thing. Says it to the 911 dispatcher. He says it to his mom in texts. He says it to the police. And he is here today through me saying it to you. So yeah, you should consider the consciousness of guilt. But that doesn't answer the question that you're here to answer today, which is, has the Commonwealth proved what it has charged? Every element, every part of it, including the part that maybe we don't even want to allow Blake, which is to say, beyond a reasonable doubt, has the Commonwealth proved that there was no mitigation here, as the judge will explain to you it means. So I am doing something that I don't do very often in this job. I am asking you to find Blake Scanlon guilty. But I'm also asking you to follow the law, to hold the Commonwealth to its burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt everything that it is charged. Over and over again, Judge Callan has said to you, you have to put, and we said it at sidebar when we were selecting you as a jury, over and over again we said you must put aside the anger, the emotion, and the sympathy. And these are all things I very much actually hope you experience when you think about the outcome of this and when you look at those pictures. I wouldn't want a jury that didn't have a reaction to that. That's not what this system is about. But I hold you to your word and the oath that you took. And after speaking to all of you, I believe that you're on this jury because you committed to doing as you said you would. Just putting aside the emotion and the anger at the outcome, which is understandable, and considering everything that went into what happened. And I do want to close by saying, when you return a verdict of guilty, as I ask you to do for voluntary manslaughter, you're not saying that anything about what Blake did was okay. I want to be really clear about that. This is not the law saying that, and this is not you saying with that verdict, that anything that Blake did that night was reasonable or excusable or justifiable in any way. That is a much different thing than what I'm asking of you today and what the law demands of you today. When you return that verdict of guilty for voluntary manslaughter, you will be saying that Blake Scanlon is guilty of a terrible and serious violent crime, a crime worthy of a tremendous amount of punishment. But the Commonwealth has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt everything that it must prove for Blake Scanlon to be convicted of murder. Find him guilty. Find him guilty of voluntary manslaughter.